Hello everyone and welcome to another AWS User Group Bosnia online meetup. Tonight with us is Alex Casalboni, AWS Technical Evangelist, and we will talk tonight about how to build MVP for your startup on AWS. Alex, the microphone is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I hope you like my fake background here. It's way better than my room at the moment. So thank you for joining. I guess you're also stuck at home. I have been stuck at home for a few weeks, and tonight we want to get a bit technical and talk about building an MVP for a startup. So maybe you already have a startup, you're working on it, or maybe you have an idea, but you don't know where to start. Well, building an MVP, it's a minimum viable product. That's usually the first step. And today I want to tell you about some best practices, some tools, some services, some of the lessons learned from many other startups that have been building their business on AWS. And so let's get started. If you have never heard of me, that's totally fine. I'm just a software developer. I'm a software engineer. I come from the web world. I've been working in a startup myself for almost 5 years, and now I speak and I organize conferences, and I've been an AWS customer for more than 4 or 5 years, and then I joined AWS a couple of years ago. So I'm just a developer like probably most of you. I want to share some of my experiences. I want to share some processes and some patterns that you may find useful when getting started with building something new. Usually it could be a startup or a side project or really anything. And then I want to conclude and dive into some cultural patterns as well, because building a startup is not just writing code. It's building a culture, an organization, a set of processes, a group of people working together. And then I also want to tell you about some of the programs that officially, can help you if you are building a startup already, or if you're planning to do so at some point, later this year or next year. It's just useful to know what's out there, what official programs you can use to get some credits, to get training, to get help, to publish or promote your products or your services. So let's get started. What the hell is an MVP? Why do people build it? The idea here is that, this is a very interesting quote that people like to use. I also like to use it because it's true. A lot of us as engineers or as developers, we think that we should only go and publish and show to the world that our perfect ideal product that is ready to be sold for $20 million. Yeah, sure, but that's not the first thing you build. Usually you start with something simple, and this quote is telling you, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of the product that you publish, you probably waited too long. You shipped too late. And when you ship too late, you don't have a chance to get to collect early feedback from your first customers. You don't even have customers because you haven't shipped anything yet. And if you wait too long to get feedback, it's very, very likely, especially in 2020, that you're going to build the wrong thing or the wrong set of functionalities or features. So usually you want to start with something simple, something that is embarrassing, but that already solves some kind of problem. So an MVP is not a prototype. It's not fake. An MVP is something that works, something that solves a problem, but it's viable, meaning it does something. It's usable, meaning that people can actually use it and do something real. You probably want to focus on the main use case, what people call the happy path. It must be lovable, meaning that some people must actually like it and enjoy using it every day so that they can give you feedback. And the last thing, it should also be testable, meaning that you should be able to get feedback quickly. I think, guys, you should mute yourselves. You can use the chat if you have any question, or use your headphones so there is no echo going around. but no worries. So this is what a lot of people think their product will look like during all the different phases. You know, you build something like a wheel, it doesn't do much. So most customers using that product will not be happy. You can't really do much with a wheel. And then you add another wheel, then you are the rest of the shape of the car, and finally maybe it's a car. So if what you're building is an incremental process that look like this, your customers will be very, very not happy until the very last version. So this is not what you want to do. What you want to do is something that looks like that. So you want your product to evolve, to add features, to reshape itself, to potentially change entirely 1 month after another. But every single stage, every single step of your prototype or your development should be able to provide some functionalities that users can actually enjoy. Otherwise, it's just a useless product for the first 2 years, and nobody is going to use that. And that's why it's important, this idea of adding value incrementally, adding value through iterations. And every iteration goes through 4 main phases. You want to design something, you want to go and build it, you deploy it so customers and users can actually see and use it. And then you want to measure and collect as much feedback as you can, so that you can then iterate and start again from designing, building, deploying, and measuring. So this idea of iterating very quickly should happen in a matter of a week or 2 weeks, not 6 months, right? So we want to be able to add value as quickly as possible, to get a lot of feedback, to have a conversation with our very early adopters, our very early users, those that probably love the product, love already the 1 or 2 features that the product has, and you want to understand how they use it and what features are currently missing. And you want to get a lot of this feedback because you want to reason in terms of, you know, not big numbers, but at least what's the next feature or what's the next issue that I can solve that creates the most value for my current users. And there are many ways of thinking about it, how you plan, what you should focus on different phases. And this is a nice framework to think about this. There are things that are very slow to build and things that are very fast to build. And at the same time, there are things that are very low in their impact and things that have a very high impact. Now, if we divide this space in 4, we can look at it and say, hey, if something is fast to build, but it doesn't have impact, right now, that is probably a distraction. You shouldn't focus on that. And there are many of these things when you go and start building a new product or a new idea. Yeah, it will just take a day or 2, but it doesn't have impact. So you are wasting development time. What you want to focus on is the high impact, fast to build features or you know, functionalities. Then there is the high impact, slow to build area. Okay, these are important, but you have to decide how slow they are, and maybe you can break them down into smaller pieces that are actually faster to build. So you can move them back to the right upper side. So you can bring high value immediately and kind of delegate these slower features to later when they are actually critically important. Right now, they are not. And then there is the totally useless area of things that are slow to build and that have low impact. Okay, this stuff is just useless. Don't even look at it. And believe it or not, a lot of startups at the very beginning focus on this phase. Things that do not really matter at all, things that customers cannot see or give you feedback about. And I'll give you a couple of examples later. But as engineers, we need to remember we are solving a problem. We are not just coding because it's fun. Coding is just a way to solve business problems. And when it comes to breaking down tasks, you want to have a task that is not 3 weeks or 3 months of development. You want a task to be defined very well, to be something that one engineer can take and complete within one sprint. One sprint could be 7 days or 5 or 10 days, not more usually, so that you can add value incrementally. So very small, minimal tasks that you can plan, and you can, for sure that in 5 days you can have these 5, 6, or 10 tasks done, so you can focus on the next iteration next week. This is the only way you can be actually very fast and collect feedback and decide which tasks are useful for the next iteration. Now, the idea of having a stand-up every morning, every day will help you a lot with this, because in the stand-up, you can have everybody, not just the developers, but also the product owners. If you have already some marketing people in your team, or if you have business, sales people or business people, or maybe some advisor or some mentor that can give you advice, just to have 1 minute each person, maximum 10 or 15 minutes every day, so everybody's on the same page. And after this meeting, you can minimize the amount of time you have to spend on team coordination during the day. This is the one time, the one slot of your time that you can dedicate to coordinating with other people. Then you go on and you develop and you build stuff and you solve problems, prioritizing your tasks, as we just said. Now, there are many ways also to increase the velocity of iteration. If you have tools that help you with continuous delivery, continuous deployment, that is also a big plus. So your developers, your engineers do not have to focus on manual and repetitive tasks. And basically that's a waste of time. So it's not 2005 anymore. There are so many automation tools that everybody can use and configure in a few clicks. So if you are already comfortable with AWS, there are many tools like code build and code deploy and code pipeline. There is also CodeStar, which is a very cool way to have a ready to use package to build stuff quickly. You just git push and CodeStar will automatically set up pipeline and deploy everything on the branch you have chosen. So there are many ways to do that. Now, when it comes to prioritizing what you are building, a lot of teams have this kind of roadmap prioritization that looks like this. So there is a lot of stuff that is not having an impact in the short term. There are a lot of things that you want to do that would have an impact so far into the future that by that time you have already finished your money. When you run a startup, you probably have some funding, or you have put in your own money, or you have some angel investors that believe in you and what you're doing, in the mission, in the team, whatever. There is a point in time in the future where you know that that money will be over. So you cannot afford working on this project anymore, basically. Startup is dead. Now, if you put too much roadmap in this area, you are not prioritizing well. What you want to do is to shrink and push everything. All the stuff that has impact should have impact in the short term. If something could potentially have impact in a couple of years, don't do that. You may not be there in 2 years. You want to focus on things that have an impact now, so you can get more customers, more feedback, more angel investors, more Series 1, Series B investors to help you grow faster. Now, there is another concept that is very important for early stage development teams that people call technical debt. This is something that it's something you cannot avoid, and it's something that basically means you are going so fast that there is no way what you build is perfect. So you will have to compromise quality at some point. Maybe you're not writing tests, maybe you're not doing things properly or going through all the phases of proper software design or architectural design. Maybe you have put everything into one big machine hoping that it doesn't break. There are many different ways to add technical debt to a project, but basically it means that you are doing things quickly, and in 1 or 2 years you will have to go back and change those things. So this will slow you down in a couple of years, but that's a good compromise to have, so you can be fast today, which is what matters. About 2 or 3 years in the future, you'll think about it. It's not even given you'll get there. So focus on making sure you can get there, and then it's a good problem to have if your startup is still up and running in 3 or 5 years. Now, the good thing to remember is that even though the absolute technical depth of your startup is increasing, over time, you will add more people, you will hire more engineers, you will have multiple teams that will work on multiple projects. So the relative weight of this technical depth on the overall productivity will actually go down with time. You will still have to go back and refactor and change and re-architect some of the parts of your system. But if you do things well, the relative weight should go down pretty quickly with time. Now, if you want a tip or two about trying to minimize the technical debt, one of the things is the idea of abstracting and building something that works not only for one system. So for example, if you're managing, just to give you a simple example, if you have a system that manages images, okay, great. You could say my system can handle images, but what if tomorrow it must also handle audio files and video files and whatever other file type you may or may not need in your whatever product. Now, instead of saying, okay, images is not enough, we need to go and design a system that works with every possible file, PDFs and Excel and video and no, okay, no, that's too far into the future to think about all those hypotheses and those use cases. But for now, if you just focus on 2, so let's say images and videos to handle in your system, you will be so much closer to being able to have the flexibility to extend the system even more to handle multiple, up to n or 10 or 20 different cases. Going from 2 to 10 is much easier than going from 1 to 10. So try to, yes, implement some sort of abstraction early on, but not too much, okay? You still want to be flexible and fast and not waste too much time on these things. Another idea is that, hey, if you build something, you have to maintain it as well. So every time I see a startup that in this very early stage starts building some sort of framework, some very cool database abstraction layer, or some things that will allow them to be so much more flexible in 5 years when they need to switch database or stuff like that. If you build something like this, you have to maintain it. I'll give you an example. In the startup I was working for more than 4 years, in the first 6 months, we were using DynamoDB. We were using MongoDB. It's probably still there. And because there was not a public object manager library for Python, the language we were using, we started building our own ODM or ORM for a NoSQL database. It's an ODM, object document mapper or something like that. So it's something that maps objects to items in your programming language to objects in the database. So you have a nice class system. It's the same with MySQL and other databases. But we stopped, we sit, and we decided that was something we needed. So we built it on our own. There was nothing in the open source world we could use. So we decided, let's build it. What's the problem? We are smart, right? We are great engineers. We can do it. But then in the next 2 or 3 years, this became a liability, not something great we built, because then we didn't have time to maintain it, to fix bugs, to add features to this thing. So one idea at the very early stage could have been open sourcing it. So many other people will start using it and helping us maintain it, fix bugs, and add new features. But if you keep it for yourself and you build it internally, and you don't maintain it, it becomes a big problem because it slows you down. So remember this. Another thing to keep in mind is, okay, where do you start from? You want to start from, I mentioned already, the happy path, something that you build at first, you're in your MVP, and this should make about 80% of your early users, of your early customers, more or less happy. Okay, it should be able to cover about 80% of the use cases. Now, then you go through the iteration, measuring and designing and building phases that we talked about. So you decide which feature you can add that will add maybe 5% more of the cases, and then you can add another edge case, another feature that will cover another 5 or 4 or 6%, and you iterate like that. But the first thing you should build is the happy path, the primary use case that is able to cover as much as possible, right? Another tip I want to give you, because I didn't do that back then, I basically went down coding for 3 years. It was great. It was a great experience, but I didn't invest enough on myself as an engineer, on training, on learning new things while I was doing all my startup experience. So I want to give you the suggestion of keep learning. It's really hard to say, hey, okay, now I stop working on my startup and for 2 hours I learn something new, because you don't even know if it's going to be useful. But trust me, because you are hands down for years building your startup, what happened to me is that I came back to the world and I'm like, hey, there are so many things that have happened in the meantime. Just to give you an example, I started around 2013 when Node.js was just getting started. Everybody used JavaScript, but Node.js on the server side was still kind of, yeah, some people are using it, but should we use it? Probably not. And then I went down 3 years and I came back and I'm like, hey, everybody is using Node. Node.js completely changed the server-side world, and you have the new ECMAScript syntax that I had to learn again, like new JavaScript. Wow, I have to learn it again. So invest time on learning and use that time that you spend on learning to actually run experiments and maybe build some very simple prototypes that might actually be useful for your startup. So a prototype is not an MVP. An MVP is a real product. A prototype is just a test that you can build basically in an afternoon or over a weekend. So my suggestion for you is learn something new and use it for learning as a good excuse to write some experiment and to write some prototypes that eventually, if you do it every weekend or once a month, you might end up with something that is extremely useful for your startup as well. I think this is a good tip to keep in mind. Now let's get into the architectural patterns that might be useful on AWS or on any other platform. I think these are useful in general, but I also want to share some services and what we see that our startup customers are doing right now on AWS. The first thing I want to tell you is that, look, monoliths are totally okay, right? If you don't know what a monolith is, it's very likely that you are building a monolith right now. It's totally okay. Everybody starts there. It's the simplest thing you can do. You build a project. All your code is in one repository. All your code is one big bubble of code where you have front end and back end and database layer, and everything is there in a big monolith that you have to deploy as a big chunk of code in some server. Totally fine. Everybody does that. And actually, for a startup, this might be the best way to do things at first, because you can be fast. Everything is there. You can do monolithic deployments, and you don't have to go around and mess with microservices. You don't have too many teams. In the early stages, you're probably 1, 2, or 3 people building your product. So the idea of having 20 microservices doesn't make a lot of sense. It could, if you are very experienced in that. But if you are 1, 2, or 3 developers managing 20 microservices, it doesn't work very well, in my opinion. So what I recommend is, okay, start with a monolith. It is totally okay, this big chunk of code will do everything you need. And then there is always time later on to break this monolith into pieces and extract different features or different parts of the system into subsystems that work completely independently from this big monolith, right? So imagine you have the, I don't know, the users system or the live chat or the video system or the object storage for your images whatsoever. So you can say, okay, now I take, I don't know, the live chat component, I re-implement it as a microservice, and I can do a migration that is incremental, one piece at a time. You don't have to rewrite everything from scratch, because that would take years, or at least, you know, a lot of many months, and you will never ever have time to stop startup development for 6 or 9 months to do a total refactor. That will never ever happen in the history of a startup. Zero probability. So one of the ways that many customers are getting started on AWS very easily is by using a content management system, a CMS. Now, this is not for your backend. This might be something that you provide to your CEO or to your marketing manager, you know, your people that want to easily and quickly update content without having to depend on you. At this very early stage, you also want to decouple people and decouple teams so they can be faster and more independent. And one way to do it is, for example, separating the front end, the customer-facing public website, for example, from the back end and the actual product and the API and everything that requires authentication, for example. If you start doing that, you can provide a simple, user-friendly content management system for your non-technical people in the team. Like a co-founder who wants to update the homepage, they shouldn't be blocked by you as an engineer to go and update the homepage. You know, if you can give them the freedom and the flexibility to experiment on the right messaging, the right call to actions, the right positioning of the product, you know, they can be much faster. So Lightsail is a very useful way to do that, because it's basically a managed way to deploy your WordPress, your Joomla, your Drupal, you know, all the more most popular CMS out there. And you know, it's fairly cheap. I think the starting point is between $3, $4, or $5 a month. So it's not crazy for a startup. If you spend, I don't know, $30 a year on your website, I think every startup has budget for that. And then at some point you want to deploy also the application code, the actual product, everything that requires authentication, right? And that part is usually a bit harder to scale, because you cannot cache everything. You know, in your front end, your homepage, 99% of that content can be cached, right? So just put a CDN in front of it. It could be CloudFront, it could be something else. And, you know, it doesn't require a lot of scaling. The backend, on the other hand, the monolith, the actual MVP, the product, might actually need some scaling, because maybe you need more than one instance. Maybe you need to scale out the web server, maybe you need to scale out the database layer, and you don't want to do that manually. Now, many startups, what they do the first six months is they deploy everything into one EC2 instance. The web server, the database, you know, everything is there. I did it too. It's totally fine. So the next step, when that's not enough anymore, when you want a little bit more resiliency, when you want a little bit more scale, because hey guys, if you are successful, and I really hope you will be, you will get traffic. You will get a lot of people on your website because you publish it on Product Hunt, or you publish it on Hacker News, and maybe 1,000 people or 20,000 people will land on your website. And you do not want them to find a server error because you cannot read or write from the database, or because you don't have enough, you know, compute capacity. So one way to achieve that is by using a service called AWS Elastic Beanstalk. So Beanstalk is a great way to deploy a monolith. So you select a runtime. Basically, you say it's a PHP application, or it's a Python, or it's a Node.js application. And Beanstalk will take your monolith and manage the deployment for you. It will manage the horizontal scaling. It will manage the database. You can have a master node and a read replica node as well. It will handle that. These instances will be in different availability zones. So if availability zone 2 goes down for any reason, like an earthquake or something huge happens, you still have availability zone 1. Okay, so this happens inside the AWS data, inside the AWS regions. Inside the region, you have multiple availability zones, and you want to build your application to scale in a resilient way. So that's one way to do it. And Beanstalk, we do a lot of this automatically without you even noticing much. It's designed for deploying monoliths. So everything is on, all your Python, PHP, JavaScript, Scala, whatever language, Go, your application runs on these instances, and they would probably read from some sort of database. It could be an RDS database. RDS is our relational database service, or it could be Elasticache, it could be DynamoDB, it could be the MongoDB or DocumentDB, whatever database you like. Right, and it will also handle the scaling. So if you can configure it to add more instances when there is more request, when the load increases, when the CPU, the memory pressure on your instances increases, it will automatically add more instances. So it does a lot of things for you. And what happened to me personally is that I didn't use it, and we were doing all this work of adding more instances or configuring more instances manually, literally manually, SSHing into the instance, updating stuff, doing the deployment. Beanstalk will do a lot of that for you. So give it a try. Now, what happens if you already have a lot of experience with microservices, or at some point in your startup path where you need to scale and to add more resiliency? Maybe your customers are enterprise customers and they require an LSA, or they require you, to be up and running 24/7 without any downtime whatsoever, any downtime whatsoever. So what you want to do is go for a microservices architecture, or at least a services architecture. They don't have to be super tiny, but at least you want to separate and isolate different services so that they, if this service fails, the video, whatever, my live chat is still working. My website is still working. My content delivery system is still working. So you want one failure to not affect all the other parts of the system. And that's one of the many advantages of microservices. They are more complex than a monolith. So I'm not giving you false hopes. There is some more complexity, but they also give you a lot more resiliency if you do things properly. So your customers, paying customers especially, will not experience failures if a little bit of the system fails, right? So that's a big advantage when you start having a large customers, even as a startup. So let me give you some examples of architecture. So you may want to build a RESTful API, an HTTP API. So you can use something like API Gateway and have AWS Lambda under the hood. Maybe at some point you want to add authentication. You can do that by using Amazon Cognito. Maybe you want to add some static files, some images, some videos, some stuff that people and customers can upload. You want to use S3. You can also use S3 to serve your static website. You put your static files on S3, it becomes a static website. Maybe at some point you also have a mobile application or a desktop application. And so these apps can use the same APIs. And maybe at some point in the backend, you want to have not only AWS Lambda, but also some containers workload. So it could be ECS or Kubernetes as a service or Fargate, so that you don't have to handle the actual infrastructure under the hood. So you don't really have to use only one compute service. You might have a bit of Lambda, a bit of containers, a bit of EC2 instances. That is up to you. API Gateway give you that flexibility so that every endpoint can potentially point to a different compute service. Now, if what you're doing is building, you're focusing on the front end part of the system, and maybe you're not a backend developer, maybe the first 1 or 2 developers that you hire in your startup are front end developers, that's totally fine. Nowadays, this is actually often a successful strategy. So you focus most of your efforts on front end so that your first customers have a great experience. And you can use a lot of services that still apply a lot of best practices on the back end, even though your developers don't have a lot of back end experience. So for example, if you use things like AWS Amplify, this is a very, very cool framework that will do a lot for you. It will create cloud resources. It will integrate them in your web or mobile application. For example, you can use a service called AWS AppSync. This is a managed GraphQL service. So you can have the GraphQL protocol instead of RESTful APIs. And behind the hood, you might have a database, like a relational database like Aurora. You might have DynamoDB. You might have other Lambda functions or even Elasticsearch. So another advice I want to give you is use the right database for the right job. Don't just throw everything at one single database. Now, it's very easy. There are a lot of managed database offerings. So you don't have to choose one. You can choose the one that is best for each individual API, for each individual functionality. You need full text search, go for Elasticsearch service. You need joins and relations, go for Aurora. Maybe you need graphs and items and nodes and relations between these nodes. So you can use Neptune, which is a graph database. So use the best one for the job. If all you need is hosting static pages, static website, check out AWS Amplify Console. This is a very cool new service that works well with AWS Amplify, and but you don't really have to use Amplify to host a static website on Amplify Console. All you need to do is connect the Amplify Console to a Git repository. It could be GitHub or Bitbucket or Code Commit or GitLab as well, I think. And then you connect the branches that you need, and Amplify Console will automatically deploy those static websites every time you git push to those branches. So super, super useful. And then you can connect the front end to your backend, deployed with AWS Amplify, the CLI tool. If what you need, or if your experience or your focus, your product building strategy is using containers, and you're familiar with Docker, you want to containerize everything. Maybe you are migrating from another cloud vendor where you already containerized everything and you already have these Docker images. You can use Amazon ECS, that's our managed version of container orchestration, or you can use EKS, that's Elastic Kubernetes Service, our managed Kubernetes offering. And both of these can have a special version that we call AWS Fargate, where the instances where you are running these containers are actually hidden, are actually managed by AWS. So it simplifies a lot the whole management of infrastructure. But remember, it's not just about computing and infrastructure. You may need a data analytics pipeline. Maybe you want to push data into a stream. You want to store this data into S3. Maybe you want to visualize this data or run SQL queries on top of this data. You can do it with Amazon Athena. Maybe you want to visualize it. You can do it with Amazon QuickSight. You just connect these building blocks. And one of my favorite services is Amazon Kinesis Data Files, because you just throw data at it and Files will compress it, encrypt it, optimize it for analytics queries, and store it very cheaply and durably on Amazon S3. So very cool. Eventually, you want to put API gateway and CloudFront logs into Kinesis as well. Maybe at some point you want to have some custom integration with Amazon Pinpoint, which is our email campaigns service. So you manage all the campaigns, and you can use this flow of incoming data to customize those campaigns. Like, hey, when this event happens, go and send this email to those users, things like that. You can also add intelligence to your systems. Imagine that your customers are uploading media files or audio, so you can let them store this audio or these files directly on S3. Then you can trigger an event that will be managed by AWS Lambda to run a little bit of code. And in this little bit of code, you can call transcribe to turn that to transform that audio into text. So it's transcribing the audio to text, and then you can run comprehend to analyze the natural language, content of that text, maybe the sentiment, maybe the language, maybe the key phrases in that audio file, and then you can store it on S3 and do the same. Analyze it with Athena, visualize it with QuickSight. So if you have a system where a lot of customers or users upload audio files, you can have the full picture, analyze everything, build dashboards, and things like that. Another use case is similar, but maybe you want to provide a search interface on top of all the video, audio, images, files that people upload. So you maybe want to use something, something similar, but you can do a lot of things in parallel using step functions. So for example, here I'm using recognition video to analyze the video content. I'm using elemental media convert to transcode the videos with different resolutions and formats. And at the same time, I'm taking the audio channel of the video to transcribe and comprehend the content of that audio channel. And I can put all this metadata into Elasticsearch, and then maybe provide a RESTful API for the same users to search these multimedia files using the metadata that are now stored into Elasticsearch. So solutions like this are actually ready to use and ready to deploy. So if you're interested, I can share a couple of links with you. But then there is a lot more. I was saying it's not just infrastructure, it's not just virtual machines. There are services that have the potential to solve a lot of problems for you. There are services like Ground Station. If maybe it's not your startup, but if your startup at some point needs to put satellites into orbit, we realized that the most expensive part of putting a satellite around the Earth for orbiting is not the satellite, it's the ground station. It's the building that you build on the ground to connect to the satellite and fetch data from the satellite when they go over it. So we built a service for that. So if you want to send a satellite in orbit, you can just focus on building the satellite, send it to orbit, and then use ground station to collect data from it. Believe it or not, that's the most expensive part. There are services like Bracket that help you with learning and prototyping with quantum computing, or services like QLDB. It's a quantum ledger database. It's an immutable ledger or an immutable database with an SQL interface, or services like Sumerian. Sumerian is a virtual reality or augmented reality service. So you can build an augmented reality scene and integrate it with services like Poly for speaking, or other services to have a human interaction with a headset, for example. And other services like Pinpoint, I've mentioned it, or services like Device Farm. If you have a mobile application and you want to test that the application works on 100 different devices, with Android and iOS and whatever operating system, you don't have to buy all those devices. With Device Farm, you can just say, hey, run these tests on this version of this device, and you can automate that part too. There are a lot of services like this. Building this kind of features, building this kind of things is probably not what you want to do in the first years of your startup. You want to use something that is ready, that gives you the functionality so you can build on top of it and build something useful for your own customers. So remember, the cloud is much more than just infrastructure. Another tip I want to give you is try to over invest on things that are difficult to change. So one of these things, for example, is security. So don't underestimate security. If you find a lot of users, a lot of customers, and then in a year, you will have a lot of enterprise customers because maybe you have a B2B, business to business model, these enterprise customers will require a lot of security, compliance, integrations, single sign-on, encryption at rest, all these things that you don't want to do later on. So overinvest at the beginning on this kind of things that are really, really, really hard to change later on, and do the right thing immediately. It doesn't mean that you have to waste a lot of time immediately. You can use something, as I was saying, that is ready. Amazon Cognito, for example, it gives you so many security, authorization, authentication, multi-factor authentication functionalities that it would take you months to implement. So try to leverage this kind of services also in the security space. I already told you, store data into not just one database where you would throw everything at it. At some point, it will explode. At some point, you will not be able to scale it. Or at some point, you will have a query capability that is not supported. So my tip is explore other database options. There is not only relational, that is what we are all comfortable with, but there is in-memory engines, there is key value stores, document stores like MongoDB or DynamoDB. There is graph databases, time series databases, even immutable ledgers like Quantum Ledger database. So think about this, keep it in mind. It's very likely that for your first MVP, you will start with something easy and simple that everybody knows on the market. So probably an SQL, MySQL, PostgreSQL database, but consider there are other options out there if what you need doesn't fit well in the relational world. And this is getting more and more common. Now, I also want to give you some cultural patterns. This is an interesting take from this guy from MIT, just not a really random guy from MIT. So he says, if you want to increase innovation, you have to lower the cost of failure. And especially if you are building a startup, you have to keep in mind that failure is definitely an option. It's not like this idea of failing early is very important. It's not very European culturally. It's more an US American thing culturally, that if you need to fail, fail early. And keep in mind that failure is an option. And what you want to do is to lower the cost of that option, is to allow everybody in the organization to be able to experiment, to try new ideas, to fail these ideas inside the company without having a high impact on everything else. So one of the ways you can reduce the cost of failure is by using cloud services, for example, that have very low barrier, very low cost of experimentation. Most of the services I've mentioned so far have a free tier that allows you to prototype, to build something quickly for free for the first 12 months of your startup. And many services, even after the first 12 months, still give you a free tier up to a given quota every month. You can use them for free. So this is one of the many ways you can use, for example, to lower the cost of that failure. You don't have to, it might seem strange to you to hear this if you are very young, but until 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, if you wanted to start a new idea or build your own startup, you needed to buy hardware, you needed to build a data center, you needed to invest $10 million on infrastructure and research and development just to connect the wires and get started. Okay, the cloud is nowadays lowering this barrier, this cost of starting a new business, starting a new idea, implementing a new idea. So realize that the cloud is actually helping you a lot with that. Another thing I want to mention is how do you minimize risk? We have this concept at Amazon that we call the one-way doors and the two-way doors. So one decision can be either a one-way door or a two-way door. It's a one-way door if once you have taken that decision, it's impossible or at least very, very hard to go back. Or it might be very hard or very expensive to go back. So you need to be very careful with those decisions. The two-way door decisions are those decisions that once you go that way, in that direction, you can easily or very, very cheaply and quickly come back and maybe take another decision another way. Now, what you want to do is maximize the number of two-way door decisions. So it's easy to go back, it's cheap and fast to go back. And you want to take as little one-way door decisions, or at least you want to take them very well and spend some time on these very critically important decisions. Another idea is to fail fast. I mentioned it already. Every product, every company had some ideas that failed, even Amazon. Maybe you remember the Amazon Fire Phone or other initiatives and products that have failed, even inside companies and organizations with a lot of budget and with a lot of smart people. So failure is part of the equation. The fact that we are smart and you are smart doesn't mean that every idea you have is successful. It's totally fine if some idea fail. The important things are that, first of all, it didn't cost you a lot to fail. And second of all, that you have learned something from it so that your next idea will be better because you have learned something from that failure experience. This is something cultural that it might be hard to accept for you personally, but since the cost of failure is very low, it's totally fine to have a lot of failures to work towards a real success later in the future. Every failure gives you a very good lesson, and you want to have a few so that at some point you know exactly what to do because you have learned so much. So think of failure this way. Don't think of failure as I'm a failed person because I've failed myself. No, that's not a good way of thinking about it. Another concept that we often talk about at Amazon and AWS is this idea of building very small teams that can be fast and that can be independent. So if you're building a startup, it's very likely that you have 2, 3, maximum 5 people in your team. So it's not a big problem. But what will happen to you in the startup, especially if you're a founder or a very early stage employee like I was, is that you will do a lot of hiring. If you are successful, and I hope you are, at some point you will need to grow your team a lot. You will need to hire more engineers, more marketing, more sales, more everything. And that's great. So first of all, you need to be able to learn how to hire new people, what's an interview and blah, blah, blah. But then you will need also to organize these teams and to let them talk and collaborate and work together. So what really works well, even in startups, is to have these small teams that can be independent. Because if you have one big team where everybody has to talk to everybody else and agree on every decision, it will slow you down a lot. While if you have small teams, we call them the 2 pizza teams, meaning that every team should be able to be fed with a couple of pizzas, the big American pizzas. But that means not more than 5, 10, maximum 12 people, not more than that. When even at Amazon, when we reach a team that is bigger than 10 or 15 people, we break it in 2 and we build 2 sub teams that will work on different parts of the system so that they can be independent. They can take decisions faster. They can own what they are building instead of having to coordinate with a lot of other teams. The last suggestion, which is also a consequence of the 2 pizza teams, is this idea of ownership. So we have this practice of, we call it, you build it, you run it. It means that the development teams that build a product are also the teams that operate and run and fix the problems and are woken up at 3 a.m. in the morning when there is a problem. So this generates two major benefits. First, the person that has to wake up and fix the problem also knows very, very well the system because they built it. So they can fix the problem faster. And the next morning when they go back to work, they will have to fix it because they don't want to be awake at 3 a.m. again next week. The second benefit is that because of this ownership, every person in the team is more connected to the product and more connected to the customers of that product. So you create this kind of internal personal ownership of every individual in the team. Nobody is disconnected from the product. And the last suggestion I want to give you is that, and this is very Amazonian, is that it's always day one. When you launch a product or when you launch a new feature, that's not the finish line. That's the first day. That's the starting point. That's when you have to start listening and measuring and iterating to add more value for your users and your customers. And you may realize what you built is not what they wanted. So you can iterate and change and pivot your idea to something else eventually. So let me give you a couple of facts also about programs and things that you can do if you're building a startup in AWS. So first of all, there are startups on AWS everywhere, all around the world in all possible verticals. Maybe you know some of these, maybe you don't even consider them startups because now they are quite famous, like Airbnb or Lime or Instacart or Nextdoor or Supercell, you know, companies like those. They have been building their startup on AWS and now they are pretty successful. Which programs did these companies leverage to be even more successful, to get training and to get credits and to get resources to help them? So this is a list of programs. The first one I want to mention is AWS Activate. And then you have a couple of other programs that will help you later on. So Activate is the one program that will help you in the formation stage and during validation. When you have validated the product and you are actually growing, these are three other programs like the APN, Partner Network, the Marketplace, and the Amazon Launchpad. So I'm going to tell you about these. And during these phases, you know, if you are a startup on AWS, you actually get support from account managers, from solutions architects in the AWS team. And this is not charged, this is for free. And you also get what we call well-architected reviews. So you can request to your solution architect to have a well-architected review to basically go through a checklist and review the current status of your architecture to detect what you can do better, what aspects of your current architecture can be implemented or refactored or re-architected better. Let me go into the details of some of these programs. So AWS Activate will give you promotional credits, will give you a business support plan. You also get credits for running laboratories or labs for internal training. You can get office hours with AWS teams. Even in this startup spotlight, you know, sometimes we run conferences or events like AWS Loft around Europe and around the world, so you can get some visibility in this kind of events. So there are different tiers that you can apply to. I don't know them by heart, I'm sorry, so I would encourage you to go and have a look at aws.amazon.com/activate, and there you'll find a lot more information about the different tiers, the different benefits, and the different requirements. You can apply quite early on, and especially if you are part of an incubator or an accelerator. And many of these accelerators or incubators are already AWS Activate partners, basically. So they can help you get started with this program. Another program is the Partner Network. You can become a, there are multiple options. Most companies are technology partners. There are also consultancy partners and training partners. I think there is also a new program dedicated to startup. I think it's called the AWS Global Startups Program. So this is invite only, but you can also request. You can show that you are interested by filling an interest form. So if you check out this URL, you can request to be part of this global startup program. I think this is more into the later stage startups where you're already at validation and you're looking for hyper growth and visibility. And then I want to mention a couple more things. So first of all, the AWS Marketplace is an interesting option if your customers are also AWS customers. So if what you're selling is, for example, a software as a service solution, or if you want to sell software or you want to sell an architectural solution, you can publish this solution on the AWS Marketplace so that all the millions and millions of active AWS customers can find your solution on the AWS Marketplace and basically buy it or use it in a pay-as-you-go model using the marketplace. So they will get all the charges in the AWS invoices and so on. So this is a good channel, I think, if what you sell is compatible with the AWS audience. If what you sell, on the other hand, is a physical product, there is another program by Amazon. It's called the Amazon Launchpad. So with this program, you actually have some sort of a spotlight for physical products on the Amazon.com marketplace. So it's basically some marketing support. You have a dedicated space on this Amazon.com section. So if you are selling something that is physical that people can buy as a physical product, that's also a good option in my opinion. So this is all. It's not too late, but I'm a bit over time. If you have questions, start asking questions in the chat. In the meantime, I'll review some of the takeaways. So remember, what's an MVP? How you can grow that MVP from a monolith to a microservices? What are the different architectural options on AWS, from Lightsail to Beanstalk, Elastic Beanstalk, to Lambda and API Gateway and Amplify and Amplify console, depending on which developers you have hired, or depending on your own skill set, you may want to choose a different option. Remember to invest where it's actually hard to change, or when it's more expensive to change later on. I would remind you, security and encryption and those kind of tricky decisions that are very, very hard to change later on as a startup or in any situation. Don't forget about culture. Maybe right now you are 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, and your culture is basically you are the culture. But when you hire the next 5 or the next 10 people, you will need to define some sort of culture. You will need to give them a framework about how you want individuals to take decisions. And I think the cultural patterns that I shared with you are useful in general in life, but especially important when you want to enable your next employees to do their best and to take the best decisions. And hey, we are here to help. So if you're running already a startup, or if you're thinking of building a new startup, leverage these programs. So activate the marketplace, the launchpad, the APN partner network. So get comfortable with these programs, learn what they can do for you, so that maybe when you build your next startup, you know how it works, you know what you can get. Okay, so thank you for joining. I am done. I hope you have learned something new about startups or something new about AWS or maybe both. If you have questions, ask me anything. I probably have another 5 or 10 minutes. Any question?
Thank you, Alex. I hope there will be some.
Hello, Alex.
Hi.
Hi, I have just a question about the building and deploying process.
Mm-hmm.
So we have one of the biggest clients. We are struggling problem with PR. So basically, we are using code commit, code build, and code pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
We want that during the pull request in code commit, we want to trigger code pipeline directly, but one of the biggest issues that we found it is code pipeline. We are not able to change the branch of code pipeline. So I don't know if you can share with us some kind of solution how we can do in an easy way. So we tried like Lambda function to trigger Lambda function and change that branch, but I don't know if there are other solution.
So what you want to do is you want that a commit or a push on code commit will trigger a deployment or a code pipeline execution, but on another branch. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, before merging, I want that developer see the building process during the PR.
Okay, but if the pull request, the PR, is on branch X, why do you want to deploy another branch? I don't get the use case.
No, sorry. So I mean, the idea is they create a different feature in code commit, and I don't really know what kind of name is this branch. But I have my pipeline that is static branch, and I want to trigger this pipeline only during the PR. So
got it.
Yeah.
So I know that there is an integration between code commit and Lambda. So you can use code commit as a trigger for AWS Lambda, your own function that you can write. So what I would do is I would try if there is a way to connect Lambda with any branch. So if you can use like a star option and say every time there is a push on any code commit branch, run this Lambda function, and that from there you can do whatever you want and create or run pipelines on whatever you want to do. I don't know if this option is actually available or if you have to specify a branch also in the trigger configuration. So I need to double check. If that's not an option, I'm not sure. I need to, of course, you want to avoid manual procedures and manual operations, right? So I need to double check if there is an automated way to intercept and trigger something when a new branch appears. I'm quite sure it is there, but I have to double check.
Yeah, you have to specify basically the branch.
Oh, got it. Yeah, I'll have a look. I'll have a look.
Okay,
thank you, Zamira. Another question?
Yeah, can I have the second question or something?
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So for CodeStar, for me, it's completely new service. I don't have experience with that service. During your presentation, I just did some tests in my computer to understand right now. So my question is, what I understand is this CodeStar create like a pipeline, code commit, code build, and code deploy. Should I create other stage during the creation of this project? Like, for example, in my case, I have like cross AWS accounts pipeline, so deploy. Should I do this with CodeStar or I have to do some manual step?
So CodeStar is a good option, in my opinion, for self-contained projects. It allows you to invite people. It defines a CI/CD pipeline for you automatically. You don't have to do anything, basically. In my experience, it's a bit harder to customize for your own whatever existing process, whatever existing conventions that you have. So you might encounter some friction there because it does a lot of magic and it's kind of hard to customize the way it already works. I think it's designed for developers and people that do not know how to set up pipeline, do not know how to use code pipeline, code commit, code deploy, and all those services. If you already have something that you know it works and you want it to work that way, it might be a bit harder for you, but it should be possible to have multiple stages. I've never done that. I think by default, CodeStar assumes you have one branch and one stage, and you just git push in that branch that will deploy that stage. But I think you should be able to modify the code pipeline to add more stages and more stuff. So I've never done that, to be honest, because I only use CodeStar for simple self-contained projects where I want to get started quickly, but still with the CI/CD pipeline up and running. But maybe, again, if you can share something about their requirements, we can look into it. I wanted to read some questions here about...
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex, for your time.
My pleasure, Zamir. About Activate. So, yeah, so what prevents you from creating new startups and get credits? Well, there is an onboarding process. So it's not like you show up with a new name and we give you more money. Usually it goes through an acceleration, an accelerator or an incubator, so they can kind of guarantee that, yes, you are part of the acceleration program. And we basically go through this kind of partnership, let's say, to assign credits to startups that we know exist and we know have a plan and investors and everything else. So that's kind of a safety mechanism. But if you want to have a free tier every 12 months, that's still available. So I don't think there is a real way to avoid that. But yeah. Also, I don't really encourage you to create a new startup every 6 months. It might suck your life. It might create more problems than anything else. Is there any other question, guys?
Looks like that's everything.
Okay, cool. So if you have more questions, there is my Twitter handle. You can find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, or maybe just add a comment on meetup.com on the group, and I'll make sure maybe I can share my presentation too, and ask me any question.
We will add video recording and presentation slides to the meetup page, and personally, to help our group, it will be the best to keep a discussion on the meetup page, so that
absolutely
we can involve more members. Thank you.
Cool. And thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much for supporting community, Alex.
My
Have a great
pleasure.
day. Stay safe. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you all.